Let's see.
Yeah.
Let's see. Hang on, wait, what was it on Spotify? Yours is probably confusing. Yeah. Okay, fine, I just have to. Kind of negative. And then when that starts, it starts.
Which one is it? Elsa?
Elsa Suarez. Elsa
one?
Suarez.
Which song?
A Carne Negra. A, and then, yeah, that's
No, we talked about it. But some of you may recognize it. If you don't, then she just died earlier this year. Elza Soares, a Brazilian activist, really, and a musician. She was quite the woman. Anyway, welcome to Trinity University. It's my great pleasure to welcome you all this evening. I'm especially delighted to welcome you to the 2022 Lennox Seminar Series, and this is the final talk in the series. My name is Anna NHK. I teach African history in the history department here at Trinity. As one of Trinity University's premier humanities lecture series, the Lennox Seminar Lecture Series brings nationally recognized speakers to the campus to discuss a variety of topics. The lecture series is made possible by the Lennox Foundation, established by the siblings Martha, David, and Bagby Lennox in 1985. The foundation makes grants totaling between $500,000 and $1 million every year to nonprofits, public charities, and projects. Its emphasis is on education, conservation, historical preservation, and nature preservation, as well as the preservation of social infrastructures. A huge thank you to the Lennox Foundation for making this evening possible, so shout out to the siblings. Tonight's talk is the final one, as I said, in the 2022 Lennox Seminar Series. The Lennox Seminar Series is joined with a Lennox seminar. So we have a seminar that goes together with a lecture series, and so we've had a seminar ongoing all semester, and we're still finishing our seminar. And the students are working on a number of papers and projects that are really interesting. This year we've been able to bring to campus a variety of speakers to talk about, for example, Asian, African-descended ritual specialists in South Asia, as well as African rulers in South Asia. We've brought speakers from different parts of the Americas to the campus also. We learned in the seminar also that Lisbon in the 17th century was, of course, African or of African descent, which I think many were surprised to learn. And we debated the meaning of the term African diaspora. What does it really mean? Rachel Kuvatar, who's here, is one of the students in the seminar. She's going to introduce our speaker. Rachel is a senior international studies major with a concentration in diplomacy and global health. She's interested in the intersection of immigration and healthcare, specifically as it relates to asylum seekers. Rachel is currently a live-in volunteer and previous medical administrator for La Casa de Maria y Marta, an intentional living and healing community for asylum seekers who come from the border or detention centers. Rachel loves to write poetry and play Wordle. And I recently found out that Rachel is also an entrepreneur. I didn't know that till yesterday. Before I hand it over to Rachel, just two things. The first is really about process. So Professor French is going to speak for about 50 minutes or so, and then we'll take questions. But first, the students in the seminar will ask the questions. So please bear with us. We'll let the students ask the first questions, and then we'll open it up to everybody else. And I also want to thank a number of people this evening. First and foremost, Stephanie Ibanez, who's the administrator in the history department, and our two student workers, Samla and Jingyi Zhang. They worked hard to make posters, flyers, make phone calls, and assist in various ways. And also my colleagues and others, colleagues here and elsewhere, who sent out emails and flyers at my request. They didn't turn around and say, stop bothering us, so I'm very grateful. Last but not least, I must thank colleagues at ITS and Tiger Network, who have made it possible for us all to be here. And Tiger Network is there in the back, and they're helping, they've helped to calm my nerves with the technology. So I'm very, very grateful. And I also want to just again say I'm very grateful to the siblings, the Lennox siblings. And now Rachel will introduce our speaker. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. It is my honor to introduce Professor French today. Howard W. French is a professor at the Columbia University School of Journalism. Professor French is a career foreign correspondent and global affairs writer and the author of 5 books, including his most recent nonfiction work, Born in Blackness, Africa, Africans, and the Making of the Modern World, 1471 to the Second World War. He is also a frequent contributor to the New York Review of Books, and he speaks French, Chinese, Japanese, and Spanish. French worked as a French to English translator in Abidjan, Ivory Coast, in the early 1980s, and taught English literature for several years at the University of Abidjan. His career in journalism began as a freelance reporter for the Washington Post and other publications in West Africa. He joined the New York Times in 1986 and worked as a metropolitan reporter with the newspaper for 3 years, and then from 1990 to 2008, reported overseas for the Times as a bureau chief for Central America and the Caribbean, West and Central Africa, Japan and the Koreas, and China, based in Shanghai. During this time, he was twice the recipient of an Overseas Press Club Award, and his work has received numerous other awards. Again, it is my great pleasure to introduce Professor Howard French.
Thank you very much for the introduction. Thank you all for coming tonight. I feel a little embarrassed to be sitting here very quickly. I hope it won't be too distracting. I certainly won't. It's really a pleasure to be here. Hosts. Okay, we'll fix that. You didn't get my good jokes?
Can you hear me better now? I have had letters through my face, I heard. I had said I wouldn't let it distract me, but I guess I let it distract me. It's wonderful to be here with you tonight. I hope everyone can hear now.
I was told the mic was on in my pocket, so I'm going to turn the volume up. It's on.
Okay, it's on.
Can you hear me better?
I don't know how this
It's definitely on.
So maybe closer to now. I can hold it like this. We'll start over. Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for the introduction, and thank you for having me. It's a wonderful pleasure and an honor to be here with you tonight. I want to start with a bit of a personal note. I'm coming from New York City. You heard that I teach there, and New York and Texas have a funny relationship. We think Texas is very far away, and you probably think we're very far away. Anyway, it's nice to be brought together around an occasion like this. I had a sister who lived for several years in San Antonio. I never visited her here then, sadly, but because she's talked to me about it so much, it feels a bit like a homecoming. And so I'm going to speak to you somewhat in that spirit, and in the hopes that we can reduce the vast distances that separate us. Dr. Ejikime said something that struck me in the margins of the auditorium before I began, which actually something somewhat daunting. She said that my book had changed the way her son, who was of student age, thinks about history. And you don't hear me well?
is this good? Am I speaking? No.
How about now?
Is this microphone on? This one?
I can try to project more, actually.
You may have to.
Yes, so are people in the back hearing me okay? This is the easiest 50 minutes in my life. All we just do sound tests the whole time.
When you bring it up to you have to
Okay, I'll just hold it here then. Great. Anyway, before we got underway, Dr. Ejikime said to me something that was I was very honored to hear. but it's also sort of daunting because I'm going to try to achieve the same thing in 15 minutes with you that she conveyed from her son, and that is that I had changed the way he thinks about history. And I want to change the way that you think about history. A few of you may have read the book already, and therefore will be that you will be able.
I think let's try without the microphone, and you project, so you will have to. It's not yeah. You're sitting comfortably, right? Then have a nice conversation.
No problem. Let me try to speak louder. Can you hear me in the back now? Yeah. Great. Closer? Okay. Try to be serious. Some of you will have read the book already. Of course, you are in a position to judge whether or not I've succeeded in changing the way you think of history or understand history if you have. Many of you will not have read the book already, and that's one of the purposes of talks like this. And so I'm going to try to achieve what Dr. Ejikeme so kindly said I achieved with her son in persuading you that the way you understand history or have been taught to understand the sort of big story of what we often call modernity, or our collective arrival in modernity, is very far off base. I know that we have some Asianists in the audience tonight. I'm very pleased by that because I not only have worked in Asia myself and have written books about East Asia myself and have profited so much from my experiences in that part of the world, but my work on my last book in East Asia actually put me on the path for the story that I want to tell you tonight. And so let me explain how that happened to get us going. I was taught, as I think most of us were taught, whether or not the word modernity was used, beginning sometime around junior high school, that we arrived in an interconnected world, a world connected, so interconnected as we know it to be, a long time ago, by means of a very specific set of processes. And this set of processes is often codified under the term age of exploration. And the age of exploration is explained to us in a very stylized and minimalist way that I think actually leaves out some of the most important, perhaps the most important details. And the way the age of exploration gets explained, beginning for many, perhaps most of us in junior high school, is that in the 15th century, some Europeans, especially in that part of Europe called Iberia, became obsessed with understanding the geography of the world. They did not do so as a matter of abstraction. They were not scientists. They were not trying to figure out, the shape of the world in particular, or prove a point in the thesis. They were looking for wealth, we are told. And so they set out at sea, led by the Portuguese, to discover a route, we are told, to the place where the greatest wealth was believed to be concentrated. And that place we know of today as East Asia. The conventional story says that the age of discovery was all about finding a route to East Asia, and that this became an almost monomaniacal obsession of the Iberians, and especially the people who led in this effort, the Portuguese. This history, or this myth history, had settled so deeply in me that I had never, even though I've spent most of my life, as the introduction made clear, sort of hopping from one part of the world to the other, including these very geographies, paused to consider whether it was true, or how true it was, or how could it be true, or how did it all happen. I just accepted it, as I think most of us accept it. And then when I was researching my previous book, a book about China, called Everything Under the Heavens, doing a lot of archival research, I came across accounts of Portuguese, let's call them explorers, in the 15th century, meaning beginning in the early 1400s, who spent a long time prior to their arrival in Asia dwelling along the coast of West and Central Africa. engaging in initially exploration, but then subsequently the discovery of enormous sources of wealth, and then finally engagement in politics, diplomacy, and trade with African societies of great complexity and sophistication. Not because I think so, because that's what the Portuguese themselves were writing in the 15th century. And so when I was researching a book that had, on the face of it, nothing to do with these questions, that I came across this set of facts, which just astounded me, because I consider myself a well-read and reasonably well-educated person, and I had totally swallowed the story of the genesis of modernity, which had cut Africa completely out of the picture. In fact, many of the standard accounts of our arrival at modernity, with this thing called the Age of Discovery, just if they mention Africa at all, they describe Africa as an obstacle, a geographic space that needs to be circumnavigated in order to arrive at the place that the Europeans were in fact, the only place that the Europeans were in fact interested in, and that is East Asia. And so as I did this archival research for that previous book, I discovered that this was not only not true, but wildly untrue. And this kind of caused me to bookmark the thought, if you will, in my own mind and say that once I complete that prior book, that I needed to come back to this history and try to understand it for myself. And so that's kind of the proximate beginnings of this book project and the beginning of our talk tonight. So to tell you why the Iberians, led by the Portuguese, set out down the coast of West Africa in the early 15th century, I have to begin in the previous century, in the 14th century. And I must begin with the history of an empire in the the Sahelian region of West Africa that was known under the name Mali in this period. In the very opening years of the 14th century, meaning the early 1300s, there was an emperor. Some people say emperor, some people say king, some people say empire, some people say kingdom. It's not important to this discussion. The leader of, let's just say, the Mali Empire, a man named Abu Bakr II, got it into his head that he should commission a series of voyages to try to find land on the far side of that body of water that we call the Atlantic Ocean. He would not have used the term Atlantic Ocean, right? He just knew it as the Western Sea. And so Abu Bakr II commissioned an expedition, outfitted a number of large boats. We're not talking about ships with tall masts for sailing, but large wooden-hulled, solid-hulled wooden boats in an attempt to cross the ocean. Let me just pause for a second to tell you why this isn't as remarkable as it sounds. We think Christopher Columbus's breakthrough was an amazing thing, right? The Europeans, we imagine, being the first people to understand that the world was really round, and that Christopher Columbus overcame the superstition of his age and set out across the Atlantic Ocean, sailing west, not fearing that he would fall off the edge or that dragons or sea monsters would consume him and his sailors, or that any other great mishap would befall him. Well, in the Arab world, since I think in the 800s, there was very careful calculations that were well established and accepted in centers of learning like Cairo and Baghdad and various other places, which had already established that the world was round, and that one could, in theory, arrive at the same place that one sets out from if one kept sailing east or kept sailing west. And so it would not have been so exceptional for the leader of an empire like Mali, which was an Islamic empire, to believe that the world was round. And so Abu Bakr II commissions these ships, these boats, as I've said, to cross the Atlantic. And the first of these expeditions fails. We don't need to dwell on the number of boats. There are numbers used in the account that I'm going to speak to you about, but I think the numbers are metaphorical numbers, and I'll explain what I mean by that in a moment. Anyway, The first of these expeditions fails. The leader of the expedition returns home to Mali, presents himself to the king or to the emperor, Abu Bakr II, and says, I regret to inform you that we lost all of the boats at sea. We arrived at a point some days off the coast where violent currents converged on us from opposite directions, one from the northwest, the other from the southwest. And most of our boats were lost. Somehow, by the grace of God, I made it back to the shore. I come here to present my regrets to you, dear Emperor. Abu Bakr II did not relent. He commissioned an even larger expedition to cross the Atlantic and set out this time with himself at the helm. That is the last we ever hear of Abu Bakr II. Abu Bakr II almost certainly himself perished at sea, along with, and here's the metaphorical number, 10,000 boats, right? So I have some East Asianists among us, and 10,000 is a metaphorical number. It's not a literal number. When you say 10,000 in many cultures, it doesn't have to be 10,000. People assign totemic numbers, like to serve as a substitute for an accurate number. It just means a whole lot, right? And so Abu Bakr II set out at the helm of an even larger expedition of a whole lot of boats, and none of them were ever seen or heard of again. I'm not making the claim that he arrived in the Americas. Some people believe that. I have never seen evidence of that, and that's unimportant to what we're going to talk about tonight. The reason this story is important is twofold. One of them is that Abu Bakr II was succeeded, as one would expect, by another ruler, a man named Mansa Musa, who actually becomes quite famous. Mansa Musa, the head of this Islamic kingdom, some years after taking the throne, sets off on his first pilgrimage to Mecca in the year 1324. Mansa Musa crosses the Sahara Desert, travels 3,400 or 3,500 miles to Mecca, stopping along the way in Cairo, which was a gigantic urban center and capital of the Mamluk Empire in that age. Mansa Musa had taken care to assemble not a convoy of boats like his predecessor, but an enormous procession of camels and horses and courtiers and servants and slaves of all kinds. People of learning who were going to go collect books and take accounts of science and Islamic studies from the Middle East and bring them home, etc., etc. And among the things that Mansa Musa brought with him, in addition to those things that he brought with him, was the largest amount of gold ever known to have been in the control of a single individual at one time. Mansa Musa travels to the Middle East, what we call today the Middle East, with 18 tons of pure gold. Mali was a gold superpower. That part of West Africa, the Sahel, has seen a succession of kingdoms, beginning with the predecessor kingdom to Mali, which was known as Ghana. Don't look for Ghana on the map and imagine you're seeing where these kingdoms were. It's a bit confusing. Mali, which is the country name Mali that you'll see on the map, is where Ghana was back then, and where Mali was back then also, okay? Anyway, so since around the year 800 or 900 or 1000 or thereabouts, somewhere in that era, from that time, that part of the Sahel had been the leading source of gold in Europe and in the Mediterranean world. All of that gold that reached Europe and the Mediterranean world crossed the Sahara on camelback and was traded via intermediaries who were controlled by the kingdoms of North Africa, Berber kingdoms and the like in North Africa. And so those intermediaries took an enormous cut in the profits of the gold as they traded the gold onward into Europe and in exchange often for European goods, which then were traded throughout their societies and back across the Sahara into West Africa. Mansa Musa, the successor of Abu Bakr II, is attempting to do the same thing, in my view, this is what I write in my book, that Abu Bakr II was trying to do by seeking to cross the sea. And what that was finding a way to cut the middlemen out. So a giant cut in the profits of the gold had been consumed by the middlemen in North Africa. This is what middlemen do everywhere. And the Malians had no way to do an end run around them. And so Abu Bakr II thought, let's cross the ocean and see if there are people there who we can trade our gold. And Mansa Musa said, I'm not going to try to make the same thing, to attempt the same adventure that led to the disappearance of my predecessor. Let me do a different approach and cross the Sahara to the much further to the east and end up in Cairo and see if I can establish an alternative route for our trade in gold, not through middlemen, but through the very rich and powerful Mamluk Empire in Cairo. Mansa Musa arrives in Cairo in late 1324 and stays through part of 1325. And during this long stay, lodged at the foot of the Great Pyramid of Cheops, he essentially gives out his entire lot of 18 tons of gold in acts of patronage to poor people, to rich people, to Islamic leaders, to courtiers and noblemen and leaders of the Mamluk Empire. He literally gives away 18 tons of gold. By the way, let me just pause to say we know of the trip or the attempted voyages of Abu Bakr II because Mansa Musa, in a court session with the ruler of the Mamluk Empire, is asked about the history of his dynasty, and he tells the Mamluks, and it is recorded contemporaneously, that his predecessor had lost two attempted expeditions had ended in disaster at sea, seeking land on the other side of the Atlantic. So this isn't a fable, this isn't some kind of imagined thing. This was recorded contemporaneously, not by the Malians, but by the Mamluks. Anyway, so when you distribute 18 tons of gold, big things start to happen, right? People learn about you. And it was no different with Mansa Musa. Word of Mansa Musa spread like wildfire through the Middle East and into Europe. And this notion of this kingdom, now suddenly Europeans begin to form an idea of where this gold that had been crossing the Sahara for centuries already must have come from. There's this guy named Mansa Musa who shows up in Egypt with 18 tons of gold and gives it away as presents. We have to find this gold. And the people most determined to find the gold, it turns out, were the Portuguese. And they were the most determined for very specific geographical and historical reasons. Right at that time, the rise of the Mamluks had cut off, and their successors, the Ottomans, had cut off access to the pre-existing routes of trade with the Far East, which we know under the label the Silk Roads. And so Europeans for centuries already by that time had been trading across the Eurasian landmass with China and with other parts of Asia for things like silk and spices and tea and whatnot. And this was a source of great wealth for Venice and for other parts of what we now call Italy and all of Mediterranean Europe. And that's all cut off. But Portugal was in an especially disadvantaged position because unlike Spain, unlike Italy, Portugal didn't even have a window onto the Mediterranean. And so Portugal, being a fairly young kingdom in this era, we're talking again, Mansa Musa's voyage was in 1325. The Aviz dynasty, which was the first great dynasty of Portugal, had really just been established 50 years, the numbers are in the books, roughly 50 years before this. The Aviz dynasty is therefore an especially young and very fragile dynasty. Control of that part of the Iberian Peninsula is coveted by a kingdom in what we now call Spain. And the Aviz, having no access to trade on the Mediterranean because they're on the other side of the Iberian Peninsula, have this extraordinary motive to look for trade elsewhere. And they learn of Mansa Musa's, the legend of Mansa Musa, and they make it their mission to discover the source of gold in West Africa. This is going to be, in their minds, their moonshot. Like, it's a really long odds thing, but if we can only discover the source of this great source of gold in West Africa, our future will be golden. We'll make it, we'll survive, we'll thrive. And indeed, that's what happens. But it doesn't happen instantly. It takes decades, which shows you a couple of things. One of them is the value that they placed on, or the importance that they attached to this idea of establishing strong links with West Africa. The other thing it shows is the hollowness of the myth that modernity really just began with an all-consuming obsession with reaching Asia. The Portuguese spent decades trying to establish these ties with West Africa after having learned of Mansa Musa. In the 1420s and 30s, they commissioned their first expeditions down the coast of West Africa under the authority of a prince of the Aviz dynasty, who we know of as Henry the Navigator. Henry the Navigator dies some decades later before any great source of gold is found. And then in 1471, a year that appears in the subtitle of my book, after persistent, prolonged, and costly efforts that required great sacrifice of this very poor and fragile kingdom, the Aviz Kingdom of Portugal, they arrive in what is present-day Ghana, the place that you will see labeled as Ghana on a map today. And at that place, in a coastal community that they eventually named Elmina, which means the mine, they discovered that even putatively poor people were walking around with gold on them. That's how much gold there was in that society. And so from those first times, just walking, docking their ship somewhere and walking onto the ground of Elmina, they already knew that they had arrived at a special place. And sure enough, this was confirmed very quickly, and over the next 10 years, an extraordinarily lucrative trade in gold was established with a minor kingdom in this place that we now call Ghana at Elmina. And the quantity of gold, the gold trade was so great that the Portuguese named their national treasury after it. The national treasury sat in the palace, like the king's bedroom is above the treasury. And the treasury was called the House of Guinea. Guinea was a generic label for Black Africa. And the Portuguese called their treasury the House of Guinea, meaning we depend on the wealth of Black Africa for our survival and our prosperity. And that wealth was being sourced in this place called Elmina. And within 5 years or so of the establishment of this trade, roughly a third of the entire crown revenue of Portugal was sourced from that one spot in West Africa. That quantity would grow over time. I'm just giving you a sense of how quickly this reached a kind of amplitude that changed the direction, the fates of this small, young, and fragile kingdom of Portugal. The Spanish learned quickly of the Portuguese success in locating gold in Elmina. The Spanish send a flotilla of ships. Spain is 10 times larger than Portugal, almost literally, and much richer than Portugal. The Spanish send a flotilla of ships to go seize control of this source of gold in West Africa from the Portuguese. The Portuguese get intelligence of what is about to happen, and so even though they had much smaller means at their disposal, they were able to lay in ambush off the West African coast, and they defeated the Spanish flotilla against long odds. And knowing that the Spanish would keep trying, or that others would come in their wake, they negotiated the construction of a gigantic fort there at Elmina, which still survives today and is known erroneously as a place that, well, it is known as it's kind of a symbol of the slave trade, because it very much subsequently became an important locus of slave trading, but that wasn't until the 1650s or so. It was built to facilitate and secure this trade
gold, which was of transformative importance to the history of Portugal, but also to the history of all of Europe and to the history of the world. This is what sets into motion the forces that we speak of when we talk about the starting of the modern world. So the Spanish get defeated, their flotilla gets defeated, the Portuguese build a fort. The Spanish form these ideas, actually both the Spanish and the Portuguese form these kind of irrational ideas, basically poor science, the geographic science, mining and metallurgy and things like that were not terribly well worked out yet in that era. And so they formed this idea that if gold is so abundant at a certain latitude in West Africa, Ghana is about the coast of Ghana is about 5 degrees above the equator, then gold must be, this must be where gold is all over the world. It's like if we just keep exploring the sort of equatorial latitudes of the world, maybe it has something to do with the temperature, like in the tropics, there must be gold in places like this. And so this is the motivation that sets afire the Spanish imagination that eventually leads to their discovery of the Americas. But before we get to that, this sets the Portuguese off on a race to explore the rest of Africa before other Europeans get involved in exploring Africa, before other Europeans become seized with the importance of Africa. And so here we have the absolute opposite of the idea that Africa was an obstacle, that all needed to be done was circumnavigated, and that everyone was racing to get to to Asia. The Portuguese discover gold in 1471 in Elmina. They don't even try to get to Asia for another couple of decades. What were they doing during those 2 decades? They were exploring this equatorial region of Africa, and extraordinarily important things, historically speaking, were beginning to happen, and we're going to talk about some of those things. Before I move ahead with the Portuguese, who are at the heart of the first half of this talk, they were tricking you. This is not a 50-minute talk, this is a 3-hour talk. I'm tricking you too. Before I go ahead with the Portuguese side of the story, I have to speak to the effect on the Spanish. So Christopher Columbus was from Genoa in a city-state in modern-day Italy. And Christopher Columbus had been seized with these peculiar ideas about the geography of the world and its spherical shape and the navigational possibilities and things like that. Christopher Columbus had been laughed out of a number of European courts as he sought financing for a venture to prove his theory about the roundness of the world several times. He had been laughed out first by the Portuguese, the Italians laughed him out, the Spanish laughed him out, and even the English laughed him out of court. It was when the Portuguese discovered gold in Elmina, the Spanish decided to reconsider. They said, look, we don't know about this guy's ideas about you can reach Japan by going west across the Atlantic Ocean. That doesn't really matter to us. We need to get into the game of exploration in the tropical seas because the Portuguese found gold in those regions, and we need to go see if we can find gold at similar latitudes in other parts of the world, or else we'll be left behind. And so this is what actually seals the deal for Christopher Columbus, who returns to the court of the Catholic rulers, what do they call it? Los Reyes Católicos. And he finally gets their funding for the Niña de Pinta and Santa Maria, and that's where the traditional account of this history begins, right? So as you can see, there's an enormous amount of prelude, and not just by the way prelude, but decisive prelude. Okay, so what's happening with the Portuguese? The Portuguese are also looking for more gold in Africa, exploring those latitudes. And within less than 5 years of discovering gold at Elmina, they stumble upon an island just north of the equator, almost exactly on the equator, off the coast of Central Africa, called which they called Sao Tome, St. Thomas. Sao Tome, when they arrived, was uninhabited. It's a volcanic island, so it's very heavily forested. And because it's an equatorial island, it receives very abundant seasonal rainfall. And so what does that mean? That means you have extraordinarily rich volcanic soil, and you have abundant irrigation, and you have tropical sunshine, right? So right at this time, the Portuguese had been experimenting with the cultivation of what was already becoming the most lucrative commodity in the Atlantic world in this era, and that commodity was sugar. Sugar was a rare thing in this age. Sugar, when I say sugar, I mean refined white sugar, was only affordable by the very richest people. We're talking about the kings and queens and the highest nobility of the courts of Europe. No one else even saw sugar. That's how expensive it was. Sugar was considered a spice and a medicine, but of the rarest kind. Somebody among the Portuguese explorers of equatorial Africa in that era decided to take some cuttings of sugarcane, which the Portuguese had begun to grow in other islands far to the north in the Atlantic, like the Canary Islands and Madeira, and plant them on Sao Tome. And lo and behold, no sooner had they planted these cuttings than, because of the special environmental conditions in Sao Tome, right on the equator, volcanic soil, the rainfall, and all the rest, the sugar just proliferates like magic, far, far more productive than in the Canary Islands or Madeira. And so the Portuguese are then presented with a problem. How do we cultivate this thing called sugarcane? This is a problem because everywhere we can trace the cultivation of sugarcane prior to this moment, we're speaking of the 1480s, in the world. Sugar originates it is believed, in the region of Indonesia or New Guinea, right? So far to the east. And it takes a very slow 1,000-year migration across Asia into the Eastern Mediterranean, finally to Sicily, places like that, and then comes out in Madeira and Canary Islands, right? Everywhere sugar had been cultivated commercially throughout that 1,000-year history, it had been associated either with forced labor or with slavery. And the reason for that is because for sugar to be grown productively, it has to be planted very densely. And for sugar to thrive, it has to be planted in very wet tropical soils, and very wet fertile tropical soils. And very wet fertile tropical soils means almost like mud. And tropical means there's lots of bugs around. And the most important bug here is, of course, the mosquito. And the mosquito carries diseases like malaria and yellow fever. And so to work in the fields, oh, there's one more item. The sugarcane leaf is almost as sharp, and this is not exaggeration, it's legendarily sharp, almost as sharp as a razor blade. And so you're working in these very densely planted fields, tromping through wet mud under tropical heat with mosquitoes carrying lethal diseases, and you're getting cut up all the time and getting infections and separating wounds from the infections in the tropics. And so no free person, wherever sugar had ever been cultivated, it was not worth it. We don't want sugar, if that's what it takes to grow sugar. But if we can find people in bondage to make them grow sugar, well, that's a good proposition. And so everywhere sugar had been associated with forced labor or slavery of some kind. And in Sao Tome, it is no different. The Portuguese get it into their minds that since Sao Tome is so close to Central Africa, they can source, in other words, seek slaves from the coastal Western Central Africa, bring them to Sao Tome to put into a structured work environment, which we call the plantation, and force them to grow sugar. And I'm going to talk about why we shouldn't call it the plantation in a minute. But this is the birth of, I would argue, the most important economic innovation of the modern age, prior to industrialization. The creation of sugar-growing enterprises born in Sao Tome, changed the world completely in ways that I hope to convince you of, okay? Sao Tome, a little tiny place, begins to produce sugar in quantities that had never been seen before in European markets. Europeans, everyone who's ever had a candy bar or a soda or anything with sugar in it knows how powerful that experience can be, and it's all the more powerful if you've never had a candy bar or a soda. And so sugar sort of immediately captures the market interest and the imagination of Europeans, and the demand goes through the roof, and this becomes an extraordinarily lucrative thing. But the institution that is created is called, not, in my view, should not be called the plantation, but should be called the prison industrial labor camp. Prison industrial labor camp. Prison because the workers are being forced to work with corporal punishment as the spur to eke productivity out of them. They are being beaten. They are being punished physically. They are being driven to keep up their production, no matter how bad the heat, no matter how bad the mosquitoes, no matter how bad the disease, no matter how bad the injury from the sugarcane leaves. Industrial, because of the scale. The sugarcane plantations, prison industrial labor camps that are born on Sao Tome, and which we will see begin to transit the Atlantic and then penetrate the entire early modern world on the other side of the Atlantic, are the biggest enterprises of the era. They are bigger in terms of the numbers of workers that are employed on them than almost any businesses in Europe of this era. And so that's part one of why we should think of them as industrial. Part two is because to produce sugarcane is a complex process that requires careful synchronicity, synchronizing the tasks, right? And so whenever you have complicated processes where timing is important, you have to have lots of specialized functions, right? These people carry out the fertilizing task, these people start with the irrigation, then the fertilizing, then the weeding, then the planting, then the cultivating, then the boiling, then the pressing, et cetera, et cetera. There were different kinds of specialists. We're talking about enslaved people working under brutal supervision who had to carry out all of these specialized tasks in a synchronized fashion. And so this is why I say prison industrial labor camp system. So Sao Tome is historically huge, even though geographically small. But this model, this utterly transformational economic form of production is about to take an enormous leap. And that leap is across the Atlantic. In 1500, I'm speaking off the top of my head, it's either 1500 or 1501, correct me if one of you knows the date, the correct date. But the Portuguese discovered Brazil. They discovered Brazil because not because they're looking for Brazil, but because they're trying to find faster ways of getting up and down the coast of West Africa. They are still not thinking about Asia so much. They're completely wrapped up in how important Africa is. And so they are experimenting with a navigational technique called tacking, where instead of hugging the coast, Africa's big, right? Instead of hugging the coast and trying to keep going down Africa, to get from one spot along the coast to another, if you form a triangle, you sail away, it's counterintuitive, but you sail away from the continent and then you cut back in toward the continent in a triangular fashion, you can make progress much more quickly. And so they begin to tack in this fashion, which was new to them, and the bigger the triangles you form, the farther out at sea you're going, and eventually they hit the coast of Brazil unbeknownst to them. And so the Portuguese make this extraordinary discovery of a whole new continent, and almost immediately this new institution, this new form of enterprise, transits the ocean with them, and the prison industrial labor complex becomes implanted on American soil in Brazil under Portuguese control in the early 1500s. The Portuguese as you can see, I don't speak from prepared notes. I've given lots of different versions of the talk. I just sort of do it. I'm going to speak to something I don't really talk about very often, but this sugar production model crosses the ocean almost immediately from Sao Tome to Brazil. But it takes the Portuguese a few decades to decide to use African labor, bonded, in other words, enslaved African labor in large numbers on Brazilian soil. And that's for a reason. The reason is it costs money to build lots of ships to bring large numbers of people across the ocean. And when the Brazilians arrived when the Portuguese arrived in Brazil, of course, there were large numbers of people already in Brazil, who we call sometimes Indians or indigenous peoples, right? And so the Brazilians, the Portuguese spent the first decades trying to devise various ways of corralling the native population of Brazil and forcing them into this production model, this new form of enterprise. And these produced unsatisfying economic results and disastrous human results. The native populations died in extraordinarily large numbers through exposure, mostly through exposure to diseases for which they had no immunity. By the way, Africans were being brought across the Atlantic from Sao Tome who were expert in the various kinds of tasks that I described as being fundamental to industry, meaning specialization. They were not brought in as crude laborers, they were brought in small numbers as specialists. Okay, so this guy knows how to boil the sugar well, let's bring him. This guy is a manure specialist, that was a job, let's bring him, et cetera, et cetera. It took the Portuguese, until 1470 before they essentially threw in, 1570, before they eventually threw in the towel and decided this thing about trying to force native populations into enslavement to work under this new form of enterprise isn't going to work. We're just going to bring Africans from Africa in large numbers. And so the mass trade, I'm not comfortable with this word trade, the mass commerce in enslaved peoples from Africa in the American environment begins around this time. The Spanish were experimenting also for sugar in places like Hispaniola, which is where Dominican Republic and Haiti are, and also in Mexico. And the Brazilians were doing so the Portuguese, I keep saying the Brazilians, the Portuguese were doing so in Brazil. This recipe of bringing Africans from Africa to the Americas to work in the prison industrial labor complex was the economic miracle of the age, as horrible as it was. And there's no other word for it than horrible. Horrible isn't even sufficient, right? The life expectancy of an African subjected to work in this kind of environment, from the moment of landing in his new country of arrival until his death, was typically between 5 and 7 years. In other words, people were worked to death by design. This is planned obsolescence which you're all familiar with in terms of your iPhones, but planned obsolescence with human beings at stake, right? There was no thought given to trying to provide livable, survivable conditions. The thought was that African life was disposable, that the profits to be made from bringing Africans across the sea in these numbers vastly overcame or outbalanced the cost. The profits vastly outbalanced the costs of doing so, and that was all the justification one needed. And so I'm going to skip ahead a little bit in the interest of time so that we don't do 3 hours, to say that, to sort of dismantle another myth. The first myth that we saw was that, this myth about circumnavigating Africa and an obsession with Asia, and I mean no disrespect to Asia, by the way. The Europeans did arrive in Asia, and they did very, very violent things there, and transformative things happened to their economies as a result of their entry into Asia as well. But the record needs correcting about where this story began. So that's where part one of my talk, what part one is concerned with. Part two is another myth, the biggest images, the most prominent and striking images that we have of wealth acquisition by Europeans in this new era of the prison industrial labor camp system in the Americas doesn't involve slavery at all. It doesn't involve sugar at all. The stories that we are left with, the magnificent tales of wealth acquisition, the founding kind of events of the Spanish Golden Century, which is what this period was actually called, are the sacking of great empires by small numbers of people who are presented as extraordinarily brave Spanish conquistadors who stride into the highlands of this place or that place, whether it's Peru and Bolivia in South America or in Aztec Mexico, and they sack these enormous empires against very long odds, and then they begin to extract the gold and silver from these places in huge quantities. Well, this really did happen, as you might suspect. We have reason to believe. The problem with this story is this was not the most transformative economic event of this age. The Spanish carted away so much gold and silver that they had to invent special new vessels to do so. These vessels were called galleons. If you have ever seen a picture of a galleon, you'll understand why they were suited for this. Very fat bellies. They're slow sailing ships that are made, they're like cargo vessels. In fact, that's exactly what they were, right? There were such quantities of gold and silver involved that they had to invent special new categories of sailing vessels to accommodate that then. But the problem is, as I said, this wasn't the leading source of wealth for Europe in this period. Already, by the last quarter of the 16th century, more money was being made in the prison industrial labor complex system through the cultivation via slavery of sugar than was made in the extraction or robbery of gold and silver by the Spanish in their conquest of these great empires. And we can see this first in Brazil, and my book details the sources for this claim. Already in Brazil, the Portuguese are making more money than Spanish in gold and silver in the last quarter in Brazil. And then we see something else happen. In 1630, the English, because it was still England, Britain isn't formed until 1707. In 1630, the English occupy an island called Barbados in the sort of southeastern Caribbean, very close to the South American coast. And they do what the Portuguese have done in Sao Tome. In fact, they're copying the Portuguese. They say, here's a tropical mountainous island with very rich soils and very abundant seasonal rainfalls. We've seen the enormous wealth that the Portuguese have been able to acquire through the cultivation of sugar. Let's do that here. And so the English set out to begin doing that in Barbados. And in fact, they hire Dutch people to help from Brazil because a little bit complicated, but Holland was it was under the authority of the Spanish crown in this period. And Spain and Portugal had fused their two kingdoms in this period. And so there were Dutch people operating sugar plantations in Brazil, and then the Dutch began a war to liberate themselves from Spanish control, and disgruntled Dutch people then were willing to hire themselves out to the English for the purposes of sharing the industrial secrets of the prison industrial labor camp system with the English, and the English used this to get Barbados underway in the production of sugar. Barbados is an island 1/3 the size of the city of Los Angeles, 1/6 the size of Long Island in New York, a geography that means more to me, right? Little Barbados in the 17th century, that tiny geography, importing 300 to 400,000 enslaved people to provide the labor, produced more wealth for England than did all of the gold and silver carted off in the galleons by the Spanish from the New World. But the story doesn't get told to us this way. In fact, this is the beginning of the British Empire. British Empire, so it was still England, but England was a bit player in this period. Spain was the great power. Portugal was a rival to Spain and a fast rising power. England was not really even also around. The reason why England settled on Barbados was because Spain, much more powerful then, had occupied the big islands of the Caribbean, right? And the English did not have the means to frontally challenge the Spanish because they were much poorer. The Spanish had had a big head start in terms of imperialism and colonization. And so the English said, well, we'll take the droppings left by the Spanish. And that's where, and the French did the same thing. And so what's known as the Lesser Antilles, the little islands that are strung out at the sort of southern end of the Caribbean chain near South America, Martinique, Guadeloupe, Antigua, Barbados and the like, Trinidad, Tobago. The English and the Trinidad and Tobago, the Spanish controlled, but those other places the English and the French took, right? And Spaniards who had Jamaica then, Cuba then, Hispaniola then, they didn't really worry about it. It's like, we've got enough to chew on for the moment, right? Little did the Spanish know that the English were going to be as successful as they were in copying the Portuguese and in acquiring the wherewithal to make themselves in short order into a great power, so great that by the late 1600s, they were able to challenge the Spanish successfully challenge the Spanish for control of Jamaica. The English seized Jamaica from the Spanish on the basis of the wealth that the English had acquired in implementing this economic model in Barbados. Jamaica, I don't have the number for you, but it's several multiples larger than Barbados. Jamaica is larger than Barbados in size. And so the English then expand this model into Jamaica, and this is really the foundation of the English and subsequently the British as an imperial force in the world. This is where they begin to get their strength economically and their power economically from it. I'll give you a little anecdote. As Americans, this sounds strange. We imagine that America, what became the United States, the English colonies that became the United States, because we're important now, they must have been really important then. They were not economically important at all back then. In fact, the English colonies of North America depended almost entirely on trade with the slave islands of the Caribbean. What does depend on them mean? I mean by that they provided what are called primary products, foodstuffs, lumber, livestock. That's what they sold to Jamaica and to Barbados and to the other Caribbean islands in exchange for, well, that's where they got their revenue from. And the reason why the islands of the Caribbean needed to source those goods there is because the production of sugar was so extraordinarily lucrative that it didn't make sense to grow corn or to raise cattle or to have any other economic activity on these islands but to produce tropical commodities. By far the most important was sugar, but there was also cocoa and coffee and indigo and various other products. Sugar was the biggest prize. Okay. One final anecdote about this is that the average income of an English citizen in Jamaica in the period of Jamaica's rise as a sugar power was 30 times the average income of an English citizen in the American colony. So just to substantiate this notion that the Americas were bit players, that the continental colonies of England were bit players still economically in this period. Anyway, I've got to wrap up soon, so I'm going to try to zoom through some really important stuff that I'm not going to be able to give justice to. Hopefully I'll induce those of you who haven't read the book to read it, and to people who have questions to engage with me in that way. This is an irresistible thing, this prison industrial labor complex. So much money was to be made this way through the employment of Africans in chattel slavery. By the way, this is the other great institutional invention of the age, or innovation of the age. Along with this industrial complex comes chattel slavery. They're joined at the hip. Chattel slavery is a very special thing. It's a historically new thing. Slavery has existed in every environment at some time or another in the world throughout history, everywhere, right? But chattel slavery is new. Chattel slavery is a thing whereby people are considered eligible for enslavement on the basis of their race, and they are dehumanized and desocialized in a transgenerational fashion. And that's why the word chattel is used. Chattel has the same root as cattle from Latin. And just as if you own a cow or a horse, and your cow or a horse has a foal or some kind of offspring, you become the owner of the foal or offspring. Well, with chattel slavery, unlike slavery that's been practiced elsewhere throughout history, the standard expectation and almost iron rule is that the offspring of the enslaved become the property of the slave owner. And so this institution is born together with the prison and industrial labor camp system. Europeans jump through all kinds of theological and legal hoops to justify the enslavement of Africans for these purposes, and this makes the transit across the Atlantic into Brazil, Hispaniola, Mexico, and then up the Caribbean, and finally, to bring this story hopefully quickly to a close, we arrive in Haiti. It's actually not Haiti yet. It's a colony of France called Saint-Domingue. So the French were late. The English copied the Portuguese first. The French then see their great rivals, the English, begin to acquire enormous wealth through these economic models that I've just described, chattel slavery and prison industrial labor camps. The French say, we can't, just like the Spanish said, we can't let the Portuguese run away with all the gold. The French say, we can't let the English run away with all the proceeds from slavery, right? So the French concentrate on making Saint-Domingue their great commodity production center using these models. And their success is just unbelievable. The French don't really get involved in this effort until the 1721, 22, thereabouts. By the 1780s, Saint-Domingue accounts for about a third of all of France's overseas trade. Saint-Domingue, the western third of the island of Hispaniola, is the richest colony in the history of mankind. It is the greatest source of colonial wealth ever seen in human history. And this is all based on the prison industrial labor camp system and the chattel slavery pushed to their greatest extreme, right? In 1791, they enslaved Africans, and they must be called Africans because they had been brought by deliberate strategy from many different parts of Africa to prevent them from conspiring against the French. Nonetheless, in 1791, they rise up in rebellion in Saint-Domingue, and they overthrow the French. They free themselves. So much money was to be made from their enslavement, however, that the story doesn't end there. They have beaten the French against all odds, right? People who didn't even share a common language were able to unite for the purposes of their own freedom and beat one of the three great imperial powers of the age, the French. Okay? What happens next? The Spanish say, we can't let those people be free. There's too much money to be made in this prison industrial labor camp business, complex business. We need to go, if the French were beaten, we'll beat them. And so the Spanish tried to impose themselves on the newly freed enslaved peoples of Haiti and were defeated in turn. That's not the end of the story. The British said, there's no way you can walk, and who could walk away from this? This is the richest colony ever seen. We're greater than we can't be intimidated because the French and the Spanish were defeated. We're the British. We are Great Britain. We're going to go in and defeat these unclothed savages, these Africans. We're going to beat them. The British, sent the largest naval expedition up until that point in their history across the Atlantic in order to attempt to defeat the enslaved peoples, the newly freed enslaved peoples of Haiti. and they were defeated. Is that the end of the story? No. The French came back again and said, we can't let this thing go. It's too lucrative. And the French then sent also the largest naval expedition in their history, anywhere across the Atlantic, in an attempt to defeat the newly freed people of Haiti, and they were defeated. And in 1804, the Haitians birthed a new republic, the Second Republic in the Americas. And in this moment, they enacted the most important value of the Enlightenment for the first time in human history. Anywhere, we think of the Enlightenment as a thing of white people, of Europeans, wearing wigs in France and in England, and the founding fathers of the United States and the like. It was the Haitians who enacted that most valuable, that most sacred principle of the Enlightenment, which said that all people are created equal. They made it a part of their constitution from the first day. I could stop here, or I could spend another 10 minutes.
I think this might be a good point to so that you can engage with the.
While we're walking up here, I'll just continue a little bit longer. Let me just say that this had enormous effects on the young United States. The Old South, the slave colonies of the Old South, now the new states of the Old South, where plantation slavery was the motor of the economy. The leaders of the Old South took flight and said, we can't keep Africans concentrated in these numbers in our midst, because if they can defeat the great powers of Europe, then they will also eventually rise up and kill us, or in pursuit of their own freedom. And so Thomas Jefferson's administration negotiates the purchase of what's known as the Louisiana Purchase from France. And the United States doubles in size overnight. And the Mississippi Valley opens up to the United States. And Thomas Jefferson and the successive administrations through Andrew Jackson then march by foot more than 1 million descendants of African slaves across continental United States to the Mississippi River Valley, where they are put under forced labor through the prison industrial labor complex system, and become the absolute center of the American economy by growing cotton. Cotton is produced, almost no cotton is produced in the United States in 1790s. By 1830s, 32 million pounds a year of cotton are being produced in this way, under this model, through chattel slavery. By 1860, the eve of the American Civil War, 2 billion pounds of cotton were being grown under this model. So from 0 in the 1790s to 32 million, or 35 million in the 1830s, to 2 billion pounds. Just imagine the progression we're talking about in output, all at the lash. Cotton is, by an extraordinarily large distance, the most important economic product of the United States in this era, the largest single export, incomparable to anything else produced in America, and becomes the motor, directly and indirectly, through ancillary industries like banking, through transport, insurance, the slave trade itself, the mortgage value captured in the bodies of enslaved peoples, against which people took loans. And cotton, and this is my last sentence, cotton is grown by enslaved peoples through these models, through these innovations, becomes the sine qua non ingredient of the Industrial Revolution. Britain, in this very same moment, is rising, preeminent industrializing power in the world, and the good that they are making, the textiles that their industrialization consisted of, is entirely sourced from this economic model in the Mississippi Valley. So I'll stop there. Thank you very much.
Okay, so we have time for questions, and like I said,
students are able to get to ask those questions. And unfortunately, some of them are on online, and I don't know if you can get the online questions, but I haven't been able to figure out how to see the questions that people may be posing online. I have one student who sent me a question that I'll pose back. Sure. But those people who want to go to the microphone and ask your questions. Colin is that excellent knowledge?
I can answer by the talk pretty much.
No question from you?
I had one, but I got answered by the talk.
Oh, you got answered,
Just
okay.
give me a minute.
Okay, so the students get the first question. Okay, so Colin, you can go ahead first.
Can you hear? Does that work? Okay. It's interesting in discussions about colonialism, we sometimes get started talking about these faceless states and forget about the agents that carried it out. Sometimes the agents work in favor of the state. Sometimes they're very self-interested. I was curious, in your narrative, do you find many instances where you find agents who are using the state's resources and acting against the state's agenda and furthering their own self-interest, and then that self-interest is ultimately co-opted by the state? I think one example is in the French Empire, in the Americas, Jesuits and other colonists that had come, the French Empire wanted condensed settlements, but they would go spread out and work against the state, but the state eventually co-opted their model because they found it more effective. So it's interesting, do you find much conflict between the people who compose this, colonies and the state's interests?
Thank you. This is a very interesting question. It's not a question that really intersects deeply with my thesis in my book, but I will say that there's one lesson that's learned repeatedly over and over in this era, in the time period that we're talking about, right? Up until, let's say, the 19th century. And which goes actually to the heart of American history, meaning the history of the United States, and that is that colonies are very hard to control from a distance, right? Because local interests, look, the colonizer wants the colony to thrive on the one hand, because they don't want to have to subsidize the colony. But once the colony, any kind of economic momentum is achieved within a colony, then local interests begin to be implanted and almost automatically begin to exploit the gap between their own immediate needs and the strategic needs of the colonizer, right? And it is out of this tension that independence movements are born. Right? And so, this is all familiar to us as Americans or people who have been students of American history, but it's seen everywhere. And the reason why this is so universal is not just a matter of the principles involved, but because of the technologies of the day, right? You can't get people across the Atlantic, Britain or France or whatever it's not easy to deploy huge numbers of troops to go put down rebellions, or until the 19th century, there was no immediate means of communication like by telegraph or things like that, right? And so there's a very strong advantage to the localized interest once any kind of economic wealth begins to be created. And so, I'm sorry, that's not a wonderfully productive answer for your question, but that's what I can offer.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. 1 second. Two more students. Rachel,
Okay. All right, can everyone hear me? Professor French, I found your thesis to be really interesting, particularly the use of the term prison industrial labor camp. I think I've never heard or read any writings that, and tell me if this is fair or not, would equate the prison industrial labor camp with slavery. I've always read it in Mr. Alexander and Angela Davis as the prison industrial complex, at least as we understand it today, was a result of slavery and not that it was actually by design from the beginning. So with that idea, how do you understand your narrative to affect the way that we conceptualize the African diaspora today and the struggles and challenges that many in the African diaspora face today?
Wow. This is like a whole semester. Where do I begin? So I'm going to come at this from left field, as we say. I'm working on the next book, which is about, the book we're discussing ends with the Second World War. And the next book is about decolonization. And it's my view that decolonization is really the greatest story of the 20th century. That this is, Westerners have their own ways of kind of imposing narratives, like to take a very provincial approach to this topic. Some Americans think the greatest story is what they call the greatest generation, meaning, okay, so they went and they fought Hitler and won, and I'm glad they won, by the way, don't get me wrong. But this is a bit of an aside, but actually the Soviet Union killed 90% of the Germans, right? Literally 90% of German casualties were caused by the Soviet Union, and not by the Western allies, not least the United States, right? And so this is just by way of illustrating the mythologizing that takes place in the way we engage these histories, right? I think decolonization is the big story, right? And I think that decolonization is not over. Some people take decolonization merely to be a matter of legal and statutorial breakthroughs. Okay, we've set up a flag state, we have a national anthem, we have our own constitution, we've got passports, we have diplomats, we've been decolonized. I don't consider decolonization to be the necessary qualities of decolonization to be exhausted with that short list, right? I think decolonization means ultimately breaking down mental and psychological barriers that have been imposed between people for the purposes of exploiting them and subjugating. And that in the context of this is not only about Africans, but since the context of today's conversation is Africans and the African diaspora, actually which you mentioned in your question, I'm addressing it in those terms, right? That Africans and the members of the African diaspora are still deeply colonized. And they are deeply colonized in the sense that they are stuck in parochial identities that are self-harming and self-limiting, and that these did not come about by accident, that these have been drilled into them, that they have been inculcated, and that education in this country and in other countries has been aimed at deepening petty chauvinism as not just as a sort of matter of course, but as a way of depriving people of any collective strength that they might gain by overcoming their differences. And so, I don't know if this has anything to do with what you had hoped to hear in your answer, but decolonization and the future of the diaspora are topics that are deeply and inextricably linked in my mind, and which need to be viewed in a much deeper way than they are normally considered.
Hello, Dr. French. First of all, thank you for your time. I really appreciated your lecture. And my question is actually related to colonization as well, just with a slightly different focus. But my question was that based on your discussion about the invisibility of Africa's initial importance and current link to the modern existence in world relations, are there any specific other efforts in addition to your work that you've been either witnessed or been a part of that are successfully operating in a changed narrative of how the world has or could continue to repair our relationship with Africa?
Oh, sure. You know, I'm speaking to you today. They turned off this thing, thank God, where I appear really big, right? I'm like this big in this story. You know, I didn't invent any of this stuff. There have been people writing on the ideas and themes that I've talked to tonight for at least a century, right? Who have labored in the vines of anonymity for the most part. And in the case of those who have escaped anonymity, were often the subject of kind of vicious attack and efforts to keep them marginalized or to discredit them. You know, I think of the most famous example here is, he's so famous it's a cliche, but it's worth mentioning, W.E.B. Du Bois, who, you know, was attacked in the mainstream. He's easy to celebrate today, right? He's long gone, right? In his time, he was attacked in the mainstream press in this country viciously. The American government deprived him of a passport, didn't allow him to travel because his ideas were so dangerous. And his ideas are the ideas that I've been speaking to, that I have tried to immerse myself in and to understand. And there are many other people like that. So he's famous, but you know, there are many. I don't want to, I mean, I'd be happy to correspond with you. I can give you a starting list if you like. You know, somebody who you may or may not know comes to mind, George Padmore. You know that name? Okay, good. Just write it down, Google him, and see, look into the life of George Padmore, just as a start. But I'd be happy to entertain this with her and with your class.
The gentleman has a question.
Yeah, very interesting and, you know, very informational, kinds of things you don't hear. But I want to ask a question that pertains to today's time with something called the critical race theory. Do you think you could make that type of presentation into a public school, public high school in America today, given the whole controversy of the critical race theory?
Thank you for your question. Look, I can't just walk into any school and talk about anything. I can't walk into a school and talk about arithmetic. You have to be invited into a school, and I'll go wherever I'm invited. I don't stop with where I'm invited. Like, I'm invited here tonight, and I'm very pleased to be with you, and I thank you for your attention. Very, from the bottom of my heart, actually. I love this kind of thing, right? But I also write. And writing is a special thing. It lingers, right? It has a special power of transmission. You never know. Somebody reads your book and then they start talking. You may never meet them or hear from them, but they start talking to somebody else about the book. And networks of ideas and knowledge and communications begin to form, and it begins to affect the way people change or think about things. And you know, I began tonight's talk with that anecdote from your son, who said I had changed the way he thinks about history. Well, almost not a day goes by when I don't receive some kind of message from someone who I never knew or heard of before, who said something like that to me. And there must be many more people I don't hear from who are saying these kinds of things. And so I don't have the illusion that I'm changing the world literally by writing a book, but I can't wait to be invited into school either, right? I mean, we have to each do what we can to enhance our understanding of our shared existence here on this planet, right? And that's what I'm trying to do by writing. That's what I'm trying to do by speaking, by answering questions, by giving interviews, by you know, doing podcasts, and by encouraging you if this is something that interests you, to say to your local school, hey, there's this guy named Howard French who's written a book about Africa's forgotten or misunderstood role in world history. We should consider having him appear here. I don't know Texas very well, but I've been to some high schools already to talk about this book. And I don't rule out the idea that, others might invite me just for that purpose.
Have you been to Texas high schools? Because I feel that your book might make a list of banned books. Critical race theory, it seems to me that a lot of it is suppressing history. It's the desire not to teach history, and so any work of history is kind of a red flag for people.
Right.
Who talk about it.
Well, I got a living demonstration of this today. I went to the Alamo, and my first time there, and I know a little bit about the history of the Alamo, and I didn't go there expecting to see history represented well, and I was not surprised. There was no history of the Alamo. It was about, here's how we preserved this thing, and here's how we preserved that thing, and here's the list of the people. But there was no context and no background and no effort inclusion or explanation of motives or anything. The word slavery I didn't see anywhere at the Alamo. So I know that Texas is not like New York, and I'm not trying to be funny by saying that, but I don't think that we should look, I didn't write my book as a polemic. I'm not out here to bash anybody over the head. I'm not trying particularly to make anybody feel guilty. I'm not trying to make anybody feel bad about themselves. I just want people to consider things, right? Or to reconsider things, that's all. And it's not the kind of thing you can force on somebody, right? And so, and that's all I know how to do. And so I'll just keep doing it. And if people want to try to invite me, I'm willing to show up. Even in Texas.
Yes, one of our viewers on the live stream, Elizabeth, asked, in your book you talk about the nexus of land, capitalism, and industrialization with regard to England and Barbados. One result you note was that England needed less land to produce foods due to the importation from colonies, subsequently devoting more land to industrial processes. Can you speak more about how these ideas in land ownership and product maximization produced cycles of oppression and mutual dependency?
Sure. So I think you're reading the question of somebody online, are you? Yeah. So I think the question is actually asking me about something called the theory of divergence between industrializing Europe and the centers of wealth in the world that have predominated for a long string of previous centuries. And the most important of those was China. China was, for the longest stretch of time, the richest center of civilization on earth, right? And so my book develops this idea, which is not unique to me, which says that England and then subsequently Britain were able to propel themselves above and beyond the wealth of China and of India by exploiting the resources of other places. And the resources were constituted the labor of Africa, the land of the Americas, and that this was kind of a magical recipe, and that to produce, so there's the grand originator of this theory is a historian of China named Kenneth Pomeranz. And the metaphor he uses isn't exactly, I have deep admiration for Pomeranz, but he uses the metaphor which isn't exactly right, which he says that in order to produce enough fiber to grow, to have the quantities needed for textiles that Britain produced, Britain would have needed to be, I'm going to paraphrase here, something like 5 times larger. It would need 5 times the land surface that it actually has, right? The problem with that metaphor is, or analogy, is that the fiber that Britain could produce on its own, because of its environment and climate, was wool. Britain couldn't grow cotton, right? There's no amount of wool that Britain could have grown which would have resulted in an industrial revolution. right? Because wool and cotton don't make the same kind of textiles. And wool is not a mass consumption textile like cotton is, right? Wool, people in the tropics and even in most temperate places don't wear wool except for maybe the coldest part of the year, right? And so cotton was the special ingredient, right? And that required conquering environmental areas that were appropriate to the cultivation of cotton, and it required appropriation through violence of the labor of Africans put to work in prison industrial labor camp models using chattel slavery, right? And so this is really the secret sauce. I'm not really differing with Pomerantz. I drew a lot from Pomerantz, but sort of correcting this notion that even with much more land, Britain could have sourced the kinds of fibers that needed to take off, which just isn't the case, right? I hope that works for the student's question.
Thank you, Professor, for your talk. Something that I truly admire about your book and your presentation is how you center Africa and Africans in the rise of modernity and in the modern world, which is something that is seldomly talked about. And I want to ask a question in that spirit, in that idea of Africans at the center of this story. So you have, since the 13th century, of these huge kingdoms, Songhai, Futa Yalon, Oyo, Dahomey, and they are thriving and they are so powerful that the Europeans could not even subdue them, and they were able to do that only in the 19th century. Mm-hmm. And they are sitting on top of this wealth, and they have all these powerful resources. And my question is, why do you think, instead of following the European path of creating all this plantation economy system using slave labor, why instead they are focusing on selling human beings to the Europeans, and they are not developing other sectors of the economy, and they are just focused on the slave trade as the main mean of their economy, as part of this agency of Africans?
It's a very complicated question. A lot of interesting things one could threads one could pull on. One part of your question is about why did Europeans generate capitalism first? And so that part of the question is relatively straightforward to answer. So it wasn't just Africans who didn't become capitalists in the era you're asking about. Nobody else was becoming capitalists in the era we're talking about. So capitalism was peculiar, and peculiar to Europe. And why it emerged in Europe at a particular moment in time in the way that it did is an extraordinarily complicated question that opens up possibilities of endless debate, right? And so I'll just leave that piece of your question there. The other part of your question is, why did Africans sell other Africans to Europeans, which allowed Europeans to become extraordinarily wealthy and to diverge from other centers of wealth and civilization in the world, as I just spoke to, right? Like, become, in a short, historically speaking, a very compressed period of time, become much richer than China or India or anybody else. Right? And the answer to that question is, this is paradoxical maybe, seen from the perspective of today. But Africans in the 15th century were not Africans. Native Americans in the 15th century were not Native Americans. They were just themselves. They didn't have an idea that we're this big group of people called the Native Americans, and the white people are coming and they're going to do this stuff to us, we better all get together and protect Native Americans. The idea of a collective identity called African is a new thing, right? It was forged out of, over a long period of time, in a kind of very sporadic, kind of violent, but also accidental way through contact with Europeans, where it wasn't until very late in the game that any Africans worth speaking of had a big synthetic picture of what's going on. Why didn't they have a synthetic picture? They didn't have a synthetic picture because Africans had no experience of chattel slavery. Even when they were selling the slaves, they didn't know what chattel slavery was. They knew what slavery was. Africans practiced slavery themselves, among themselves, but it was not chattel slavery. Africans acquiring slaves typically through conquest of one people conquering a neighboring people, took slaves among the defeated and absorbed those slaves into their own populations, typically very rapidly. And we're speaking about Africa, very large space, right? So there's a lot of variation, but typically absorbed and assimilated the captured people rapidly. And that is because among African societies, which were not capitalist societies, wealth was measured very often, I think typically, in terms of the size of the population under the command of a ruler. And so a ruler had an incentive to assimilate the captured or the defeated into his own realm, because it's by being able to say, look how many people we are, that's the greatest measure of how wealthy they were. It was not in how much money they had, right? Which is how a capitalist measures wealth, right? And so Africans didn't have a experience of chattel slavery. They couldn't imagine, chattel slavery was new, historically speaking, period, in the world. They couldn't imagine chattel slavery. They didn't know to what purposes the white people were they knew the white people were capable of great brutality, but they didn't know to what purposes the white people were going to put these captured people. The captured people, the sold people, were put on boats and sailed across the Atlantic out of sight and out of mind of the people they left behind and the people who sold them on the shore of Africa, right? How many Africans made it to the New World, saw plantations, and came back to Africa and were able to say, hey, fellow Africans, by the way, that would have been quite a shock for one African to say to other people of not his own group, hey, fellow Africans. They would have said, what are you talking about? Hey, fellow Africans, there's this thing called chattel slavery on the other side of the Atlantic. No, there was no conversation like that at any time.
Oh, can I add something quickly, then I'll let you. We were having this discussion in my class because we watched the documentary, and the art historian who was recently the director of the Museum of African American Arts in Washington, D.C., who's gone to another job. In the documentary, he says, the question about why were Africans selling Africans. So in my class, we discussed this, and I said, as you said at the beginning, slavery, I always say to my students, slavery and marriage are the two institutions you find all over the world. Slavery and marriage. They're in different forms, but no one ever says,
and sometimes go together.
Sometimes go together. No one ever says, why were Europeans selling other Europeans? I've never heard that. Never read that anywhere.
Actually, they did.
We're selling Europeans all the time, right? The word slave comes from originally Islam, right? So we never asked the question, why were Europeans selling other Europeans, but not about Africans? And as you said, Africans didn't have this concept of Africa because, they didn't until recently. And it's not some of the question about, wars. People say, oh, why are Africans killing each other? I haven't heard anyone saying that recently about the war going on in Ukraine or Russia.
I have to say that I probably didn't ask the question properly. What I was trying to ask is, for example, why the Fulas were selling susus, or why the Fulas were selling baras or bais from the ethnic groups that they were raiding, instead, for example, of enslaving them in their own food alone. So I understand, I'm pretty well aware that the construction of Africans still identify themselves as Africans. They probably discovered the Africanness in the Americas, that makes sense.
In Haiti.
In all the new world. But my point was, and you answered, I was saying to ask the question again, is why instead of the Dahomeyans enslaving the Libyans, they didn't develop their own plantation economy systems. That's what I mean by that. Not Africans.
So there's two. So these are very good questions, and this is clearly somebody who's reading or studying a lot about this.
Just to finish the last point about that, I mentioned something fascinating as well about the lack of communication between the East and the West. Let's say Africa, the Americas. But there were many African nations traveling to the New World and going back and doing business.
What do you mean by many? How do you define many?
Well, let's say
Africa in the 18th century had 100 million people.
For example, in England, Africans send their African kings from many of these small-sized kingdoms. They send their sons to study in England.
Sure, I wrote about that.
Right, of course. No, you wrote about that. Your book described that beautifully. And many Africans also went to Brazil. and they were agents from Luanda, Angola, and they went back. So there was a communication back and forth. So they knew where they were going. They knew they were going to be enslaved.
So my problem with this, money is a vague word, right? 18th century, the peak of the slave trade. Africa in total has perhaps 100 million people. How many people came back and forth from Brazil to Africa? Yeah, can you venture a number? 1,000? 500? 10,000?
Let's say, but 20 in a community, that means that they knew what was going on the other side of the land.
In an era before there's mass communications, I don't think that's many.
It's not many.
Okay,
But it's enough.
then we agree.
It's not many, but it's enough for...
Enough for what?
For the kings and the rulers and the merchants to be aware of what was going on the other side. It's like they were completely clueless this time around.
So the Brazilians, the traders you're talking about, this is a specialized conversation, we're losing most of the audience. But the Brazilians who, you yourself call them Brazilians, they're Afro-Brazilians.
Yes.
Who are coming back and forth from Africa, from Brazil to places like present-day Nigeria, or to Congo, or to Angola,
Yes.
right? They're no longer Africans in their own heads, if they ever were Africans. They're Brazilians.
And I think you're both agreeing.
This is just a minutia. This is just a minutia of something that is fascinating. Because I like it. Thank you, sir.
But another question arises. So, like, these are fruitful questions. Like, why didn't the Congolese or Benin or Oyo or whoever like make their own cotton plantations and sell it?
Okay, Professor.
I just want to finish this sentence. How would they have sold that?
Good point. I don't know.
Did they have ships? Did they have access to European ports? Would the Europeans have let them sail their goods on the high seas?
Okay, that was such a productive, useful question. Thank you. You're next.
Thank you so much. I'm really happy to be here. This is a new passion of mine, and YouTube. So I want some validation to make sure that I'm understanding correctly. My view of slavery has been very American-centric, as in the United States. And I was really surprised when I saw online a short clip that shows the migration with little dots coming from Africa across to Brazil, to the United States, to different parts of the world. And I was really surprised at the number of dots that signify each ship migrating out, how densely it was on Brazil, until I heard you tonight explain that they were the powerhouse. And I was really surprised at how few were actually coming to the Americas. And in my mind, all this time, I thought it was our country that was the main slave state. And it was interesting to learn that, no, we really, in terms of scale, it was really Brazil and other parts of the islands that had by far more migration or slave trade coming to other parts of the Americas.
Sure.
So I wanted to know if you agreed with that, because sometimes you can't trust what you see.
No, that's a fact. The source of that graphic is the most widely respected database of the slave trade. I've seen the graphic you're talking about, and let me just add on to what you've said. So I spoke about Barbados and how it was foundational to England and subsequently Britain's rise as an imperial country. By the way, nobody in Britain learns that. British people get taught that their empire starts in India. Nobody in Britain gets taught that their foundation of empire is in Barbados, okay? Barbados, which I described to you as 1/3 the size of the city of Los Angeles in surface area, received as many slaves as the United States, the entire United States, in this prison industrial labor camp system. That is what fueled, in that intensely concentrated, intensely exploited environment, the takeoff of Britain, or England initially, and of Britain as a power, right? The other thing I want to say to you is related to what I said about the greatest generation. So Americans are people who place great stock in exceptionalism. By the way, there's lots of kinds of exceptionalism in the world. Americans are not exceptional in having exceptionalism, right? But American exceptionalism is exceptional, right? And the greatest generation is like the slavery thing. So we liberated Europe, right? They don't know that 90% of the Germans who were killed by the Russians, right? Or the Soviets, right? Well, same thing with slavery. Slavery was an awful thing. There's been slavery in the United States. By the way, I have slavery on both sides of my ancestry, mother and father's family. So I'm not making light of this at all, right? But American slavery was like the appendix of slavery in the Americas, right? It was a little tiny thing, relatively speaking, relative to Brazil, but not just Brazil. Cuba, Jamaica, it was the same size as tiny Barbados' slavery, right? We don't really, Mexico has its own, everybody's got their own myths, right? Mexicans don't realize that Mexico was a gigantic market for slavery for a long time, right? Gigantic. And so American slavery or the history of enslavement in the United States is a very modest-sized tile in a big mosaic, and it's taken on the amplitude in terms of the wavelength or bandwidth that it gets in discussion of slavery because the United States has so much bandwidth, because Americans have so much voice, because American publishing is what it is, because American media is what it is, because actually another reason which is important, which is that the population of African Americans in this country is a large population. That's not because there was a lot of slaves there were a substantial number, 400,000 slaves brought to this country, enslaved people brought to this country, right? But once this trade in slaves was abolished in 1807, 1808, the slave owners in the United States said, hey, we better stop killing all of our slaves and working them to death like in 5 years. Let's allow them to at least live long enough to have children and produce offspring. And so this regimen of slavery in the United States became very different for that reason than the regimen of slavery in Jamaica or Barbados or Brazil, right? And therefore we have now a large population of African Americans for that reason. Thank you.
Okay. We've covered a lot of territory, and thanks for coming now, Professor. Appreciate you being here. I've often wondered why. Can you hear me okay? Yeah, all right. You covered a lot of territory there, and much of that isn't taught, in public school, or even at the college level, really, the way you put it. But I've often wondered, this is, I guess it's kind of the psychology of the group of people, but why was it the European who were willing to exploit folk for riches almost by any means necessary, as opposed to the other way around? I don't know, were there people in Asia or Africa who went around the globe to that extent doing that sort of thing? I haven't heard of it if it did. So I often wonder, what was it about the history of the European that led them to carry around that frame of mind and be willing to do that to their fellow human beings?
Thank you very much. I love the spirit of your question, and it's a question that lends itself to controversy. Okay, I don't want to essentialize Europeans in answering your question. However, it cannot be denied that Europe was the vector of historical processes that are quite unique. Some good, many bad, right? It's our obligation to try to understand this, right? And I can offer, we could have a long conversation about this, but I can offer some quick riffs to try to address your query. First of them is, and this may shock Europeans to hear this, but Europe was a very marginal place for a very long time. It was a refuse heap of history, as one of the great European historians of today said. It was like a slag heap. Nothing great was happening in Europe for a really long time, historically speaking. Europe was a place that defeated peoples from other places, sort of tended, they got kicked out of where they were, and they ended up, because you couldn't go any further, they ended up sort of concentrated in Europe, right? All of the great civilizations of antiquity were in Asia, broadly defined, right? Europe was not the place in the grand sweep of history. Recently, we think of Europe as the center of learning and of science, right? In the broad sweep of history, Europe was not a great center of learning or of science. I gave you the example of Arab geographers who knew, and Persian geographers who knew in the year 800 that the world was round. And we have heard about an African guy in the year 1305 who had the ambition of crossing the Atlantic and really actually tried. Right? Europeans were not trying that yet. Right? So Europe has been this marginal place, and through a series of accidents, historically speaking, Mansa Musa, the guy who shows up with 18 tons of gold, is an accident, historically speaking. At a particular moment in time, this happens, and it sets the imagination of a certain part of Europe on fire. The tragedy is that we lost all account of that in the telling of how we arrived in modernity, and my book is a part of an attempt to try to correct that, right? The other thing has to do with Christianity, right? It's not every religion that believes in crusading. It's not every religion even that believes in converting people. Jews don't try to convert people. Buddhists typically don't try to convert people. But Christianity and Islam have this shared ideology of just war based on religious conquest and conversion, right? And so this accident that I described of figuring out what the Europeans had longed to know for a long time, where is all this gold coming from? And this juridical, theological set of justifications based on Christian doctrine, that it's okay to go do whatever you want to do to other people as long as you sprinkle some holy water on them or say a prayer, right? That these things happen in a particular, come together in a particular moment of time, and they give Europeans the motive in their own minds and the justification in their own minds for everything they did. The only peculiar thing about any of this to me is that once they succeeded in it, they didn't want you to talk about it. They don't want you to understand it this way. They want you to understand their success in terms of their virtue, what most people would consider virtues, not what most people would consider atrocities. We have the scientific method, we have the Protestant work ethic, we have the Judeo-Christian belief system, we have individualism, all of these things which are described as special merits or attributes that attach to European civilization, which sound positive to many people on the face of them, have been used as explanations for the success of Europe to the extent that they have crowded everything else out of the picture, right? And that's what we need to overcome. And it's not again, I don't say any of this to make a European feel bad. I got nothing against Europeans, but I do think we should take history seriously and think deeply about how things came about and to account for them. And so if you believe that, then you have to dismantle myth. You have to question conventional narrative. You have to ask provocative questions. You have to be willing to accept answers that are sometimes don't make you feel better, right? And so that's my best shot at trying to answer.
I think that was a useful final answer to a wonderful question. Historians in the room can really, in a way, the idea of dismantling myth and history is important, it's very important. And I can't thank Professor French enough for this wonderful talk. If you haven't read the book, please read the book. And I really encourage everyone to keep dismantling the myths about history, but also about the present. And I just want to leave you with a final thought. When you hear about poor African countries and you understand the money, if you can do some investigation to find out how much money these poor African countries send to the US or France or the global north, that might actually cause you to pause and to see how even in the present, we're constantly making myths about Africa, so it's a constant battle. Please join me in thanking Professor French.